Welcome back to Celebrity Radio. It's Alex Belfield talking to some of my favourite people and some of the most interesting people as well. And there's a man who's released a brand new book. He's had a tremendous career. His new book is called Vagabond, and the man is Gerald Seymour. How are you, Gerald?
I'm very well, thank you very much.
It's lovely to talk to you, and let's start with you because you've had an incredible life. I mean, you're a curious man, you're an interested man, you're a journalist, so I presume you're always thinking.
I suppose so, yes. The journalism bit is deep in me. It's that sort of malarial type microbe that's in my bloodstream, and fortunately I still have that instinct to say what's going on behind that door and why can't I look through it. So I'm quite good at kicking doors in, and I'm quite good, I think, at persuading people that they could give me a little bit of their time and talk to me.
Has journalism or politics ever been more depressing than it is now? It seems like the carpet's been ripped from under it and we're suddenly seeing the wood for the trees. It's not great right now, is it?
No, the politics side, the Westminster or the White House, that sort of level of politics is not something that I've ever been particularly interested or fascinated by. Journalism has changed dramatically, and I feel that there is a risk-averse attitude at the moment, and the great days of the 60s and 70s when we travelled abroad and spent money like it was water. For instance, I remember once we chartered a plane, an executive jet in the middle of the night to fly down to Tripoli, Libya, in pursuit of the Black September people who'd survived the Munich Olympics thing, and the foreign editor on that Saturday night asked, "And how much is that plane going to cost?" And my producer said, "I haven't the faintest idea," and put the phone down on him. Now, that was the way we lived in the good old days. And this, if you want something, if you want me to just get into a little rant, this thing where somebody in the studio says, "Well, let's go over to Cairo now, and our correspondent, blah, blah, blah," and they exchange 30 words, and he then hands on to another, usually BBC staffer, and this sort of world where you stand in front of the camera and pontificate from the roof of the hotel is so boring compared with what I think in my day we were fortunate enough to be able to do, which was chase after pictures, which is what television, for instance, is all about.
But I suppose there's a danger involved with that. I wonder whether it's a health and safety thing as well. I mean, you took risks in your day, didn't you, to get the story?
We took huge risks if we thought the BBC were further up the road than ITN were, and they took the huge risks on the other way around. Yes, but, you're young in those days, and you believe there's a terrific halo around you that is protecting you from danger, and it only happens to other people, and that's the way you live your life. And there comes a stage when maybe after 15, 20 years you say that might be a little bit silly, and then is a time to take that sharp step backwards.
Do you have a story you're most proud of? Is there one that you broke or that you investigated that you think, I did it, I did my job that day?
I think there are two big exclusives that I got. One was that trip I mentioned when we went down to Tripoli, Libya, and I got a world exclusive with these 3 young Palestinian guys, part of the Black September team. The other 5 had been shot dead by the German police, and I think that was a terrific scoop. And the Libyan authorities, for some reason, believed me and wheeled them up in front of me. Interestingly, though, it was terrific to have those guys on our camera. One of them speaking quite good English into our microphone, but it was one of the poorest interviews that I ever did, I think, because I took a very hostile attitude towards them. They were the people who had come into the middle of the Olympic Games, the Olympic Village, and had desecrated, if you like, the whole Olympic movement by their attack. And so I felt it was my job and my position to be aggressive and sharp. And of course the result was, yes, I made all those statements, editorial type statements to them. But did I learn very much about this particular young man? stammering through his English? No. So from a point of view of television, it was all right. From the point of view of the future novelist, it was not very good.
I suppose hindsight's a great thing. If we could all relive interviews, we'd all do things so differently, wouldn't we?
We would indeed, yes.
I probably would have thought of a better question to ask you already, Gerald, to be perfectly honest. Listen, congratulations. I spent my Saturday on a train reading your brand new book, Vagabond, and it's very clear that you've lived a life and you've experienced a lot because your writing is so detailed.
What I try and do, I think, attempt, is to write from the point of view of the small people who are quite far down the ladder in terms of influence and importance, but the ones who get their hands dirty, go to the unpleasant places, and I suppose in a way I try and champion those ones because they're the people, the individuals who serve the state, who get very few plaudits, very little recognition, and in many cases can be left quite damaged by the experiences and what they've been through. But they, to me, are the heroes, and they are certainly not the Whitehall warriors and the military brass and the civil servants and that sort of thing who are higher up the chain. I try and champion little men and women who, in fact, go to the front line, to the edge of civilization, so to speak.
It's interesting because this character you've created, Danny Curnow, he's always lived an army life. And I think for people who haven't experienced army life, it's hard to understand, A, the humour, and B, what they go through. I was lucky enough to do some shows for BFBS in Germany. How did you get to know the psychology of somebody who's been in the army and in that environment of laughing at the dark side? That's really what they do, don't they, to get through it?
That's the protection. I mean, if you're ever with tough policemen on a particularly vile murder inquiry, or you're with a fire brigade team after a horrible mind-crunching blaze which has killed children, there is always that humour, that what we call black gallows humour, and outsiders don't understand it and think it's very disrespectful, etc., and very cold-blooded. But that is the way in which these guys survive. And I was with the British Army as a journalist, but close up and personal, so to speak, in Cyprus, in Aden for 6 months, in Borneo, in Singapore. I saw them over about 4 or 5 years, constantly in Northern Ireland, which became, I suppose you could say, my second home. And I have huge respect for those young guys. I mean, I would have been, say, in my middle or late 20s, but a lot of them were 19, 20, 21. And there is, amongst the young officers, the young NCOs, and the young private soldiers, there is a terrific sense of belonging to a family. And I really appreciated that. And, all right, I was only a witness, if you like, looking in, but that family is very strong and very tight and protects the guys.
And of course, your story is about a young man who is on the front line and then walks away, and then he's lured back by the MI5. You sort of have to go through the dark stuff to be able to come out the other side and then find a new career, and that's what this man did in your book.
It's very, very difficult for them, I think, to just come back into Civvy Street, and sadly, we're going to be exposed as a society to that now that a whole host of young fellas are coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan, and they will find it after the experiences they've had in Basra or in Helmand very, very difficult to slot in, if you like, to the boredom, banality, etc. of civilian life, and it's a huge problem for them. And there's a thing I'm interested in. I hope I don't rant on about it, but this post-traumatic stress disorder is something which is going to exist to an increasing degree in our society. And we as ordinary civilians, so to speak, we have to be very sympathetic of this condition and very tolerant. I think it was Kipling, who wrote about the fact that we all love our soldiers when they go off to war. Tommy Atkins this and Tommy Atkins that. But the moment the conflict is over, we tend to shove them out of our mind and push them further back in terms of our attention. But we shouldn't, because there was a time when a whole host of young men stood up on the front line in our name, and they should not be forgotten.
What I love about soldiers as well is they're non-political. They never ask why we're going to war. If they're sent to do a job, they go and do it. And that's very selfless, isn't it?
It is utterly selfless, because for the most part, the most occasions, if they were asked why, they wouldn't get a decent answer. And whatever the politics between Downing Street and the White House were on a particular wet Thursday afternoon, suddenly we've got 2,000 or 3,000, a brigade of young Brits parcelled off to some corner of the world which they'd never heard of before the plane lands.
Gerald, your book is enormous, and I sat there on a train on Saturday trying to get through it, and it was riveting. I just couldn't help but ask myself, how do you remember what you wrote on page 36 to then refer back to it on page 206? You must have an incredible mind.
That is one of the most serious problems of aging. I'm getting a little bit senior at the moment, and I think it's about 20 years ago that I first started to be called a veteran. Right. Yes, to remember what I wrote. And there's a very, very conscientious lady somewhere in North London, and she's the one who points out to me that on page 50 she's got blue eyes, and on page 450 she's got grey eyes, it is a problem, because there can be a single nuance, if you like, in a paragraph at the beginning of a book, which should actually kick off a theme that runs right the way through it. So in terms of what I've written the previous week or the previous month, that is something I begin to struggle with a little bit.
But you've done a magnificent job with this. Of course, your first book was Harry's Game. I don't think you get a much bigger success than that. That was a good way to start, wasn't it? I suppose your difficulty is following up with something as good.
Yes, and I had a super job at that time. I was a travelling reporter with the International Press Corps, etc., when ITN was a very powerful player on the global news gathering circuit. And so I wrote this book, which I thought would be an interest. It was in the slipstream of Frederick Forsyth's Day of the Jackal, I would have to say, which was hugely admired. Brilliant book. And I was one more journalist having a go at it, at the business of writing a thriller. It was a film option in the States. It was a Reader's Digest condensed book. It was a Book of the Month Club in New York main selection for the autumn. And it was a huge paperback deal. And that really wrecked, to an extent, my journalistic career, which I had assumed I would go on with, until I sort of bowed out and went to work as a PR for the Coal Board or something. And suddenly into my life was pitched this completely different option. I tried to do the two jobs for about another 3 years, and then gave up and realized that one was going to fail dramatically, and walked away from being a reporter, physically but not psychologically. And I walked away from that and said, right, I'm going to be a writer full time. And
is that a little bit bittersweet then, that you sort of had to end one career to start another, despite how successful it's been?
Yes, I thought so. I thought that there was going to be a real disaster, so to speak. Either I was going to miss a story that I ought to have succeeded with, because my mind was only half there, or I would write a thoroughly bad book. I think the thing that convinced me, I took the family after the Montreal Olympics. We went from Rome, where we then lived, down to Tunisia, and we had 3 weeks in a beach hotel, lovely hotel. And my wife and the two little boys were out on the sand or in the pool, etc., or riding camels around. And I sat in this hotel room, pathetic, and I typed 2/3 of a book, one of my better ones, I think, called Kingfisher. And then on the 20th day, the day out and lay on the beach, and eventually got on the plane the next day, the colour of a pillar box, and barely able to sit in the seat. So that was trying to do the two things, and it was silly.
Yeah. Is there any greater affirmation for a writer than to have a TV company come to you and say, right, we want to turn this book, this bit of paper, into something theatrical, something cinematic, something for TV? I mean, it must mean it's great, because there's a million books, there aren't a million TV shows, are there?
I've got my fingers crossed at the moment, because there's two Los Angeles-based companies and a London-based company. In the last 2 months, I've signed option contracts of different books for, and there's another one that's being talked about in London at the moment. But so it would be, and I've had 6 or 7 made into TV films on both sides of the Atlantic. But the first thing for me is to write a book, and if anything else happens, that is just a terrific, terrific bonus.
Congratulations on this new book. It's called Vagabond. It's out now by Hodder and Stoughton, and it really is something special. It's a story of a young man's life, really, and what a thrill it is to read something so detailed and brilliant, and that really only could come from a journalist's mind like yours. Congratulations. Gerald Seymour's new book, Vagabond, is in your stores now. Thank you, Gerald.
Thank you very much indeed.